The first time he walked into a university classroom, nobody saw a scholar. They saw a man with prison in his past, years stolen from his future, and a face that carried the weight of mistakes most people never come back from. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not at the front of the room. Not as a professor. Not as a man whose ideas would one day challenge the very system that had once locked him away. Because before the lectures, before the books, before the applause and respect, there were iron bars, cold concrete, and a life that looked finished long before it had even begun. And what makes this story so extraordinary isn't just that he survived prison. It's that he walked out with something far more dangerous than anger. He walked out with a mind that refused to die. This is the story of a forgotten genius who was written off by society, buried by circumstance, and nearly erased by a system that had already decided who he was supposed to be. A man who went from inmate to intellectual, from a prison cell to the halls of academia, and in the process forced the world to confront a question it never wanted to answer. What if the people we throw away are the very people capable of changing everything? To understand how impossible his rise really was, you have to go back to the beginning, before the prison number, before the criminal record, before the classroom, back to a child born into a world that offered him almost nothing. He came into life in the early 20th century, in a country where race, poverty, and violence weren't just obstacles. They were structures, systems, rules. For a poor black boy growing up in America, intelligence alone wasn't enough to protect you. Curiosity didn't shield you from hunger. Talent didn't stop the world from treating you as disposable. His name was Nathan Hare, or rather, that is the kind of story you might expect. But this story belongs to a different man, one whose journey was even more brutal, more complicated, and more revealing of America's deepest contradictions. His name was Malcolm Little. Long before the world knew him as Malcolm X, long before he became one of the most electrifying minds and voices of the 20th century, he was just a boy growing up inside a storm. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a follower of Marcus Garvey, a man who believed black people deserved dignity, self-determination, and freedom in a country determined to deny them all three. That belief made Earl dangerous in the eyes of white supremacists. It made the family a target. Threats came early. Then terror followed. Their home was burned. The message was clear: stay in your place, or we will destroy everything you love. But the family didn't have a place. Not a safe one. They moved from city to city, trying to outrun hate, trying to build some kind of life. And then, when Malcolm was still a child, his father was found dead beside streetcar tracks in Lansing, Michigan. Authorities called it an accident. The family believed it was murder. For Malcolm, the distinction hardly mattered. The result was the same. His father was gone. The family collapsed into poverty. His mother, Louise, fought to keep everyone together, but the pressure was relentless. Welfare agencies hovered over them, not to help, but to judge. Every decision she made was scrutinized. Every struggle was treated like proof that she had failed. Eventually, the system did what it often does to vulnerable families. It tore them apart. Louise was committed to a psychiatric hospital. Malcolm and his siblings were split up and sent into foster care. In a matter of years, he had lost his father, lost his home, lost his mother, and lost the fragile idea that the world could ever be fair. That kind of pain does something to a person. It can break you, or it can harden into a quiet fury that waits years for a voice. At first, Malcolm looked like the kind of child who might escape his circumstances through sheer brilliance. He was sharp, articulate, observant. He did well in school. Teachers noticed him. For a moment, it seemed possible that intelligence might become his way out. Then came the sentence that changed everything. One of his teachers asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. Malcolm said he wanted to be a lawyer. The teacher laughed off the idea, told him that being a lawyer was no realistic goal for a black boy, suggested carpentry instead. Something more practical, something more appropriate. It was a small moment on paper, just a few words in a classroom, but for Malcolm, it was devastating, because that was the moment he understood something brutal. No matter how smart he was, no matter how hard he worked, the world had already drawn a line around his future. and it had no intention of letting him cross it. He stopped believing in school after that, stopped believing in the promise it sold. And when belief disappears, drift begins. As a teenager, Malcolm moved to Boston, then to Harlem. Two places alive with music, nightlife, hustle, and danger. If his childhood had been shaped by grief and abandonment, his youth was shaped by reinvention. In the city, he became someone else. Not the bright student from Michigan, not the vulnerable boy from a broken family. He became Detroit Red. The nickname came from his reddish hair, but it soon came to represent something bigger, a new identity built for survival. Malcolm stepped into the underworld with the intensity of someone trying to outrun himself. He worked odd jobs, shined shoes, ran with hustlers, gamblers, drug dealers, and thieves. He learned how power worked on the street, who had it, who pretended to have it, and who paid the price when things went wrong. And for a while, that life offered something the rest of the world had not: control. Or at least the illusion of it. In a society that had humiliated him, stripped his family apart, and told him his dreams were absurd, the streets gave him a different education. Fast money, fast talk, fast danger. Every scam, every hustle, every night in smoke-filled rooms felt like a rebellion against the life he'd been handed. But rebellion without direction has a way of collapsing into self-destruction. By his early 20s, Malcolm had fallen deep into crime. Burglary, drugs, numbers running, petty theft. He moved with a growing recklessness, as if some part of him no longer cared whether he got caught. Maybe prison already existed in his mind long before it existed in his reality. Maybe when the world convinces you that your life is cheap, you start spending it that way. Then, in 1946, it happened. He was arrested for burglary and sentenced to prison. At just 20 years old, the door slammed shut. And with it, so did whatever remained of the life he had been trying to build. Prison is supposed to be the end of a story like this. The place where wasted potential goes to die. The place where a smart young man with a broken past becomes just another file in a cabinet, just another inmate in a uniform, just another cautionary tale. For Malcolm, prison began that way. He entered as a man full of rage, profanity, arrogance, and restless energy. He challenged guards. He mocked religion. He distrusted authority. He carried the emotional debris of his entire life into that cell with him. On the outside, he looked hard. On the inside, he was still haunted by the same questions that had followed him since childhood. Who am I when everything has been taken from me? And more dangerously, who could I have been if the world had given me a chance? The answer did not come all at once. It began with letters. While Malcolm was in prison, several of his siblings wrote to him about the Nation of Islam, a religious and political movement that preached black self-discipline, racial pride, and separation from white society. At first, Malcolm resisted. He had spent too long distrusting institutions, too long mocking faith. But prison has a way of forcing confrontation. When the noise of the outside world disappears, you're left alone with your own mind. And Malcolm's mind, for all its anger, was starving for structure. Eventually, he began listening, then reading, then changing. He stopped smoking, stopped eating pork, stopped cursing. The transformation startled people around him. But the deeper shift wasn't just moral or spiritual. It was intellectual. Prison gave Malcolm something he had never truly possessed before: time. And once that time collided with his hunger to understand the world, something explosive happened. He started reading in the prison library. At first, it was difficult. He realized how much of his education had been fragmented, interrupted, incomplete. So he did something almost unthinkable in that environment. He rebuilt himself from the ground up. He copied the dictionary by hand, page after page, word after word, definition after definition. He later described it as one of the turning points of his life. It wasn't just about vocabulary. It was about reclaiming language itself. The same world that had tried to define him as criminal, failure, delinquent, inferior. He was now arming himself with the words to define himself. And once that door opened, Malcolm didn't stop. History, philosophy, religion, politics, science. Literature. He consumed books at a relentless pace, often reading by the dim light that leaked into his cell after lights out. While prison was designed to shrink him, he was expanding in every direction. His body was confined, but his mind was becoming enormous. This is where the story takes its most important turn, because Malcolm wasn't just educating himself to feel better. He was building an entirely new consciousness. He was connecting his own pain to a larger history of oppression. He was learning how slavery, segregation, colonialism, and racial violence had shaped the world around him. He was realizing that his personal collapse had never been entirely personal. It had been political, historical, structural. That realization changed everything. The man who entered prison as Detroit Red was slowly disappearing. In his place, something far more formidable was emerging: a disciplined thinker, a ruthless reader, a man learning how to turn suffering into analysis and analysis into power. By the time Malcolm left prison in 1952, he wasn't simply reformed. He was transformed. But transformation doesn't guarantee acceptance. In some ways, it can make life even harder, because now he had to walk back into a society that still saw him as a black ex-convict, while carrying a mind that had outgrown the categories society had prepared for him. He joined the Nation of Islam and quickly became one of its most dynamic ministers. He dropped the surname Little, calling it a slave name, and replaced it with X to represent the African name his ancestors had lost. It was a symbolic act, but also a profound intellectual statement. Malcolm was no longer willing to let history erase him quietly. And then he began to speak. At first, it was in small gatherings, temples, meetings, community spaces. But his words had electricity. He spoke with the urgency of a man who had rebuilt himself in a cage and now saw the entire country as a larger prison, one built not from steel bars, but from lies, racism, and economic control. He was fearless, sharp, uncompromising. He could make an audience laugh, then make them uncomfortable seconds later. He could dissect American hypocrisy with surgical precision, exposing the gap between the nation's ideals and its reality. He spoke not like a polished academic, but like something more dangerous, a self-taught intellectual with first-hand knowledge of both the street and the system. And people listened. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Malcolm X had become one of the most visible and controversial black leaders in America. He helped expand the Nation of Islam dramatically. He appeared on television. He debated journalists. He challenged civil rights leaders. He unsettled white audiences and energized black ones. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a radical. To the state, he was a problem. But the deeper irony was this: the man who had once been dismissed as a criminal was now functioning as one of the most important public intellectuals in the country. No formal degree, no university title, no academic office. And yet his ideas were shaping national conversations about race, power, identity, and liberation. This is the part of the story where most people assumed the transformation was complete. It wasn't, because Malcolm's rise was about to collide with another painful truth. Even the movements that save you can become prisons of their own. Inside the Nation of Islam, Malcolm found discipline, purpose, and a framework for understanding black oppression. But over time, cracks began to appear. He became disillusioned by internal hypocrisy, especially the behavior of Elijah Muhammad, the movement's leader. He also began to outgrow some of the nation's rigid doctrines. The world was changing, and so was Malcolm. Then came 1963. After President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm made a controversial remark about the violence in America coming home to roost. The statement triggered outrage, and he was suspended from speaking publicly on behalf of the nation. But the suspension wasn't the real story. It was the symptom of a deeper rupture that had already begun. Malcolm was changing faster than the organization that had helped create him. And soon, the break became unavoidable. In 1964, he left the Nation of Islam. It was one of the most dangerous decisions of his life. He wasn't just leaving a movement. He was leaving the only structure that had fully embraced him after prison. The institution that had given his rage direction. The platform that had turned him into Malcolm X. Walking away meant risking isolation, public attack, and possibly worse. But Malcolm had spent too many years becoming himself to stop halfway. And what happened next would elevate him from influential minister to something even more significant, a thinker with global vision. That same year, Malcolm traveled to Mecca. The pilgrimage changed him. In Mecca, he encountered Muslims from every race, background, and nationality praying together as equals. For a man whose political worldview had been shaped by the raw brutality of American racism, the experience was profound. It didn't erase his critique of white supremacy. It didn't soften his understanding of oppression. But it expanded him. It forced him to revise, refine, and deepen his thinking. That mattered because Malcolm was one of the rare public figures willing to evolve in real time. He returned from the pilgrimage with a more international perspective, connecting the Black struggle in America to anti-colonial struggles across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He began speaking less as a sectarian religious minister and more as a global human rights advocate. He met with African leaders, addressed international audiences, and tried to bring the plight of Black Americans before the United Nations. In other words, Malcolm was becoming more intellectually dangerous than ever. Not because he was louder, but because he was broader. He had gone from street hustler to prison scholar, from prison scholar to minister, and now from minister to independent political thinker with international reach. He was no longer just criticizing American racism. He was reframing it as part of a global system of exploitation and domination. And that made him difficult to control. It also made him vulnerable. By 1964 and early 1965, Malcolm was under immense pressure. He received death threats. His home was firebombed. Surveillance intensified. Tensions with former allies escalated. He knew he was in danger. The question wasn't whether powerful forces wanted him silenced. It was who would get to him first. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X stood before an audience at the Audubon Ballroom in New York. He had come to speak. Instead, chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the room. Malcolm was shot multiple times and killed in front of his wife and children. He was 39 years old. 39. A life that had already contained more reinvention, more contradiction, more courage, and more intellectual force than most people achieve in 80 years was over in seconds. And that should have been the end. But it wasn't, because ideas are harder to bury than bodies. In death, Malcolm's influence only grew. His autobiography, written with Alex Haley, became one of the most important books of the 20th century, a blueprint of self-education, racial consciousness, moral struggle, and radical transformation. Students, activists, scholars, artists, and political leaders across the world found themselves in its pages. Not because Malcolm offered easy answers, but because he embodied something far more powerful. Proof that a human being can be remade. Proof that the mind can become a weapon against the limits imposed by class, race, trauma, and incarceration. Proof that a man the system marked for disposal can force that same system to hear him anyway. And this is where the title of this story reveals its deeper truth. From Prison to Professor is not literally about Malcolm becoming a university professor with a faculty office and lecture schedule. It's about something more interesting than that. Malcolm became a professor to the world. Not through credentials, but through clarity. Not through academic permission, but through intellectual force. He taught from podiums, interviews, debates, books, and lived experience. He taught that language matters, that history matters, that self-respect matters, that the stories societies tell about criminals, about race, about failure, and about worth are often designed to keep power exactly where it is. He taught that prison can crush a man, but it can also expose the architecture of the world outside it. And he taught, perhaps most importantly, that transformation is never clean. That is the part of Malcolm's story people often simplify. They like redemption when it is tidy. They like transformation when it is polite, marketable, and easy to celebrate. But Malcolm's journey was none of those things. It was jagged, uncomfortable, furious, contradictory. He changed, then changed again. He challenged enemies, then challenged allies, then challenged himself. He refused to stay frozen in a version of truth that no longer matched what he had learned. That is not weakness. That is intellectual courage. And maybe that's why his story still feels so alive today. Because beneath the politics, beneath the speeches, beneath the controversy, Malcolm's life is really about a terrifying possibility that the line between lost cause and great mind is often nothing more than opportunity, discipline, and time. Think about what prison was supposed to do to him. It was supposed to confirm every stereotype ever thrown at him. It was supposed to reduce him to a number, erase his future, and prove that the teacher who laughed at his dream had been right all along. Instead, prison gave him the silence in which his mind became impossible to ignore. That doesn't romanticize incarceration. Malcolm's story is not evidence that prison is noble or necessary. It is evidence of the opposite. It shows how much brilliance society is willing to bury, how many people are broken before they are ever given the tools to become whole, and how often institutions confuse punishment with justice. Malcolm did not become extraordinary because prison was good for him. He became extraordinary because even prison couldn't finish the job the world had started. And maybe that's the hardest part of the story to sit with. How many Malcolm X's never got the chance to read the books. How many brilliant, wounded people were buried under addiction, poverty, violence, and neglect before anyone saw what they were capable of. How many minds were dismissed as dangerous when they were really just uncultivated, unheard, or cornered by circumstance? That question reaches far beyond one man. It reaches into every classroom where a child's ambition is laughed at, every neighborhood where survival gets criminalized, every prison where intelligence is treated as irrelevant, every system that would rather label people than understand them. Malcolm's life doesn't offer comfort. It offers confrontation. It forces us to look at what happens when a society abandons a child, punishes the broken adult he becomes, and then acts shocked when that same adult emerges with a clearer understanding of the system than the people who built it. By the end of his life, Malcolm X had become many things: minister, organizer, father, icon, target, symbol. But beneath all of it was the same boy who once wanted to be a lawyer and was told to dream smaller. The world tried to shrink him. It failed. Because the forgotten genius at the center of the story was never forgotten by history. He was forgotten by the people who needed him to stay small. And in refusing to stay small, Malcolm created one of the most remarkable acts of self-invention in modern history. He turned rage into discipline, pain into language, isolation into study, study into power, and power into a voice that still refuses to die. That is why this story matters. Not because it is neat, not because it is comfortable, not because it gives us a perfect hero, but because it reminds us that the most dangerous transformation is the one nobody sees coming. The moment a person the world has already discarded decides to educate himself, define himself, and return stronger than the system that tried to erase him. And once that happens, the story is no longer just about survival. It becomes about reckoning. If this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting for you in the description. Another rise shaped by struggle, power, and the kind of truth history almost buried. And if you want more documentaries about ambition, downfall, hidden genius, and the people who fought their way back from the edge, subscribe to Rise from Zero. Because some stories don't just deserve to be remembered, they deserve to be heard all the way through.